The bustling aisles of Willow Creek grocers were alive with the hum of carts rolling across tiles, the chatter of shoppers, and the occasional crinkle of a chip bag being opened by a sneaky child. It was a typical Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when people hurried through the store to stock up for the week ahead. Among the crowd was Darnell, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a kind demeanor and a quiet confidence. He navigated the aisles with a purpose, a grocery list in hand, and a soft hum escaping his lips as he mentally checked off items. Darnell loved this small grocery store. It was in the heart of a suburban town he'd moved to a few months ago for work, a chance to start fresh. The people here were mostly polite, albeit distant, and the tranquility of the area was a welcome change from the noise of his previous neighborhood. He reached for a jar of marinara sauce when he felt a pair of eyes burning into the back of his neck. Turning his head, he noticed an elderly woman standing a few feet away, her wiry frame stiff with indignation. Her tightly permed white hair gave her an air of severity, and her lips were pursed so tightly they seemed to disappear into her face. She clutched her purse in one hand and a can of soup in the other, glaring at Darnell like he had personally wronged her. Darnell chose to ignore her, chalking it up to the occasional odd encounter he'd grown accustomed to. He placed the jar in his cart and moved down the aisle. But the woman didn't let it go. Instead, she followed him, her heels clicking against the floor with an insistence that matched her gaze. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Darnell stopped and turned, surprised to find her so close. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his tone polite but firm. "What do you think you're doing here?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "Shopping, like everyone else," Darnell replied, a hint of confusion crossing his face. Her face twisted into a sneer. "I don't think so. People like you don't belong here. This isn't your kind of place." The words hit him like a gut punch, but Darnell held his composure. "Ma'am, I don't know what you're trying to say, but I'm just here to buy groceries." Her eyes narrowed. "I think you know exactly what I mean. Go back to your slums. You don't belong here." The aisle seemed to go silent, the hum of the store fading into the background. Darnell felt a flush of heat rise in his chest, not from embarrassment but from anger. He'd dealt with ignorance before, but the venom in her tone was something else entirely. "Excuse me," he said, his voice lowering slightly, a dangerous calm washing over him. "You heard me," she hissed, gripping her purse tighter as if his presence alone was a threat. "This town doesn't need people like you coming in and ruining everything." Darnell took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay composed. "Ma'am, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm not going to let you talk to me like that." A young mother pushing a stroller paused at the end of the aisle, her eyes darting between the two. The tension was palpable, and a few other shoppers began to notice the confrontation. The woman, emboldened by the attention, raised her voice. "Oh, so now you're going to threaten me," she exclaimed, her words sharp and accusatory. "See? This is exactly why people like you shouldn't be here." Darnell's jaw tightened. "I'm not threatening you, ma'am. I'm standing up for myself. You don't get to treat people like this. People like you," she spat, her voice rising further. "You're ruining our neighborhoods, taking over our stores, bringing crime and filth." The young mother at the end of the aisle stepped forward cautiously. "Ma'am, maybe you should calm down," she said softly, her face a mix of concern and disbelief. "Stay out of this," the older woman snapped, waving her hand dismissively. "This doesn't concern you." The commotion drew a store employee, a young man wearing a red vest with a name tag that read Ethan. He approached hesitantly, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, his voice wavering slightly. "No, it's not," the woman barked, pointing a bony finger at Darnell. "This man is harassing me." Darnell's eyebrows shot up. "Harassing you? Are you serious right now? Ethan looked between the two, clearly uncomfortable. Maybe we can all just take a breath and... I'm not taking anything from him, the woman interrupted, her voice shrill. He doesn't belong here, and he knows it. A murmur rippled through the growing crowd of onlookers. Some looked outraged, others uncomfortable, but no one seemed willing to intervene. Darnell's hands tightened around the handle of his cart, his patience wearing thin. Look, he said, his voice firm but controlled, I came here to shop, not to deal with this nonsense. If you have a problem with me, that's on you, not me. The woman's face turned red, her anger reaching a boiling point. How dare you speak to me like that? I've been in this town for 40 years, and I won't let someone like you talk down to me. Ethan held up his hands, trying to defuse the situation. Okay, everyone, let's just... But before he could finish, the woman lunged forward, her free hand aiming to shove Darnell's cart away. The sudden movement startled everyone, and the jar of marinara sauce in Darnell's cart teetered dangerously. Darnell stepped back instinctively, his voice rising for the first time. Enough. The store fell silent. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was deafening, thick with tension as the elderly woman froze mid-motion, her trembling hand hovering above Darnell's cart. Her face twisted with a mixture of shock and indignation, as if she couldn't fathom someone daring to speak back to her. Darnell took a step closer, his broad frame now towering over her. His voice was steady but carried a firmness that silenced any whispers in the aisle. You've crossed a line, he said evenly, locking eyes with her. You don't get to treat people this way. The woman scoffed, pulling her hand back and clutching her purse to her chest like a shield. Don't act like you're the victim here, she snarled. You come into our neighborhoods, our stores, and expect us to just accept it. Darnell exhaled slowly, a part of him tempted to walk away and let her stew in her ignorance. But he knew this wasn't just about him. People like her thrived on silence, on the assumption that no one would stand up to their bigotry. I moved to this town because I thought it was better, he said, his voice resonating through the aisle. I thought it was a place where people could live without being judged for the color of their skin. Clearly, I was wrong about you. Her eyes widened, and her mouth opened as if to retort, but before she could, another voice rang out. He's right, said the young mother who had been standing nearby. She stepped forward, her hands gripping the stroller tightly. You're out of line, ma'am. This isn't how we treat people here. The elderly woman turned sharply to face the young mother, her face flushing red. Oh, so now you're taking his side. You don't even know him. I don't need to know him to see what's happening, the mother replied, her voice calm but unwavering. This isn't about him. It's about you and your behavior. The crowd had grown larger now, with a mix of shoppers and employees gathering to watch the unfolding scene. Whispers rippled through the group, and more than a few people pulled out their phones, capturing the moment. The woman's eyes darted around, her indignation faltering as she realized she was no longer in control of the situation. This is ridiculous, she muttered, shaking her head. I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking. No, another voice chimed in, this time from an older man in a flannel shirt. He stood near the end of the aisle, his face stern. You're saying what you're thinking. Don't drag the rest of us into your nonsense. The woman's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, her words failing her as more people voiced their disapproval. Why don't you just leave him alone? Someone else called out. Yeah, this is embarrassing for all of us, added another. Ethan, the young store employee, finally found his voice and stepped forward again, his face a mixture of nervousness and determination. Ma'am, he said firmly, I'm going to have to ask you to either calm down or leave the store. We don't tolerate this kind of behavior here. The woman's head snapped toward him, her expression incredulous. Excuse me? I'm the one being harassed here. No, you're not, Ethan said, his voice gaining strength. You're the one causing a scene. And if you don't stop, I'll have to call security. The mention of security seemed to shake her. She clutched her purse tighter, her lips trembling as she looked around at the crowd. No one was on her side. The realization seemed to hit her all at once, and her face twisted into a mask of bitterness. This isn't over, she hissed, glaring at Darnell one last time before turning on her heel and storming down the aisle. As she disappeared around the corner, a collective sigh of relief swept through the group. The tension that had gripped the store began to dissipate, replaced by a murmur of conversation. Darnell stood there for a moment, letting the adrenaline ebb away. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been gripping the cart until he let go, his fingers aching. "Are you okay?" the young mother asked, stepping closer. Darnell nodded, though he felt a heaviness in his chest. "Yeah. Thanks for speaking up." "Of course," she said, offering a small smile. What she said was awful. No one deserves that. Ethan approached, his face still pale but his tone apologetic. "I'm really sorry about all of that," he said. "Are you sure you're okay? Do you want to file a complaint or something?" Darnell shook his head. "I appreciate it, but I'm fine. People like her aren't worth the energy." The older man in the flannel shirt stepped forward, extending a hand. "You handled that better than most would've," he said. "Name's Bill. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." "Thanks, Bill," Darnell replied, shaking his hand. As the crowd began to disperse, Darnell felt a mixture of emotions: relief, anger, and a lingering sadness. He had moved here to escape the prejudices of his past, but moments like this reminded him how far the world still had to go. But even in the ugliness of the encounter, there was a glimmer of hope. The voices that had risen to support him, the strangers who had stood by his side, they reminded him that not everyone was like her. Pushing his cart down the aisle, Darnell resolved to finish his shopping. He wouldn't let her ruin his day. Darnell continued through the aisles, trying to shake off the heaviness of the encounter. The cart's wheels squeaked faintly as he maneuvered around displays and shoppers, but his thoughts remained clouded. He had dealt with prejudice before, but the raw malice in the woman's words lingered like a bad taste. He glanced at his list, forcing himself to focus. Milk, bread, and eggs were still unchecked. With a determined breath, he headed toward the refrigerated section, his stride purposeful. He wouldn't let her win. Near the dairy aisle, he noticed Ethan again, now speaking with another employee. The young man looked over and gave Darnell a small, apologetic nod. Darnell returned the gesture before grabbing a carton of eggs and placing it in his cart. "Hey," a voice called softly behind him. Darnell turned to see the young mother from earlier. She had stepped away from her stroller, her toddler still occupied with a colorful toy dangling from the handle. "I just wanted to check on you," she said, her tone kind. "That was a lot back there." Darnell gave her a faint smile. "It was, but I'm okay. Thanks for speaking up. It meant a lot." She shrugged modestly. "It was the right thing to do. I'm sorry you had to deal with that in the first place." "It's not the first time," Darnell admitted, his tone tinged with weariness. "Probably won't be the last, either." She frowned, her brow furrowing in sympathy. "Well, for what it's worth, not everyone here is like her. Some of us are glad to have new faces in town." Darnell nodded, appreciating the sentiment. "Thank you, Emily," she supplied, offering her hand. "Darnell," he said, shaking it. They exchanged a brief smile before Emily returned to her stroller and Darnell resumed his shopping. The small moment of kindness lightened his mood, but he couldn't fully shake the incident from earlier. As he approached the checkout lanes, he noticed a commotion near the front of the store. Curious, he slowed his pace, craning his neck to see what was happening. It was the same elderly woman. She was at the customer service desk, her voice loud and sharp as she berated the manager, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair. Completely unacceptable, she was saying, gesturing wildly with her hands. That man threatened me, and your staff did nothing. Is this how you run your store? The manager looked visibly exhausted but maintained his composure. Ma'am, we've reviewed the security footage, and it's clear that no one threatened you. In fact, you were the one instigating the confrontation. Her face turned beet red. You're siding with him? Of course, you are. This is exactly what I'm talking about. People like him think they can do whatever they want, and now you're letting them get away with it? Darnell's chest tightened as he watched the scene unfold. He debated whether to intervene or simply leave, but before he could decide, the manager raised a hand to silence the woman. Ma'am, if you continue this behavior, we'll have no choice but to ask you to leave the premises, he said firmly. This is a place of business, and we expect all our customers to treat each other with respect. Her mouth opened to argue, but the sight of two security guards approaching seemed to stop her. She huffed loudly, grabbed her purse, and stormed out of the store, muttering under her breath. The tension in the air lifted as she disappeared through the automatic doors. A few scattered claps broke out among the shoppers, and the manager sighed, rubbing his temples. Darnell turned back toward the self-checkout lanes, eager to finish his trip and leave the store behind. He scanned his items quickly, his movements brisk but steady. As he was bagging his groceries, a voice startled him. Hey, man. Darnell looked up to see Bill, the older man from earlier, standing a few feet away with a bag of apples in his hand. You handled yourself well back there, Bill said, his tone sincere. Better than I would have, that's for sure. Thanks, Darnell said, offering a small smile. Bill hesitated for a moment before continuing. Listen, I know it doesn't mean much coming from a stranger, but not everyone here thinks like she does. You've got more people on your side than you might realize. Darnell nodded, appreciating the gesture. Thanks, Bill. It does mean something. Bill gave him a firm pat on the shoulder before heading toward another checkout lane. Darnell finished bagging his groceries and made his way toward the exit. The cold January air greeted him as he stepped outside, his breath visible in the crisp air. He loaded his bags into the trunk of his car, his mind still replaying the events of the past hour. As he closed the trunk and got into the driver's seat, he caught sight of the elderly woman in the parking lot. She was sitting in her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as she stared straight ahead. Her face was a mask of fury, but there was something else in her expression, something closer to fear or humiliation. Darnell didn't linger. He started his car and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving her behind. The drive home was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the silence. As he pulled into his driveway, he resolved to put the incident behind him. But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. The warm glow of the porch light illuminated Darnell's face as he stepped out of his car. His home, a modest single-story house tucked into the quiet suburbs, was a sanctuary he had worked hard to create. He carried the grocery bags inside, his mind still weighed down by the earlier events. Placing the bags on the kitchen counter, Darnell unpacked them methodically, his movements precise as he arranged items in their designated spots. He tried to distract himself by planning dinner, but the woman's words echoed in his head like an unwanted melody. Go back to your slums. You don't belong here. The venom in her voice felt like a slap every time he recalled it. He had thought that moving to this town would mean escaping such blatant hatred, but today had proven otherwise. As he sat at the dining table with a plate of spaghetti and a glass of water, his phone buzzed on the counter. He reached for it, expecting a work email or a text from a friend. Instead, it was a notification from a local community group he had joined online. Curious, Darnell opened the app and was greeted by a flurry of posts. To his surprise, the incident at the grocery store had made its way online. Someone had recorded the confrontation and uploaded the video, and now the comments section was ablaze with reactions. Some were supportive. Good for him for standing up to her. This kind of behavior has no place in our town. But others were less kind. We don't know the whole story. Maybe he provoked her. This is why you shouldn't bring certain people into nice neighborhoods. Darnell's jaw tightened as he scrolled through the comments, the mix of ignorance and empathy stirring a storm of emotions within him. He had always known that change was slow, but seeing such blatant division laid bare was disheartening. A knock at the door startled him, pulling him away from the screen. Darnell set his phone down and walked to the door, peering through the peephole. It was Emily, the young mother from the grocery store, standing on his porch with her toddler balanced on her hip. Darnell opened the door, surprised. "Emily. How did you?" "I asked Ethan," she said quickly, cutting him off. "I hope it's okay. I wanted to check on you." Her tone was genuine, and Darnell found himself nodding. "Yeah, it's fine. Come in." Emily stepped inside, shifting her child to her other hip. "I saw the video," she said as she glanced around his living room. "It's all over the community page. People are talking about it." "I noticed," Darnell said, his voice clipped. Emily frowned. "Some of the comments are awful, but a lot of people are supporting you. I just wanted you to know that." Darnell folded his arms, leaning against the back of the couch. "I appreciate that, but honestly, I'm tired. I've been dealing with this kind of thing my whole life, and it's exhausting." "I can't imagine," Emily admitted, her voice soft. "But you shouldn't have to deal with it alone. People like that woman, they're loud, but they don't represent everyone." Darnell sighed, running a hand over his face. "I know. It's just hard to remember that sometimes." Emily hesitated before speaking again. "Look, I'm part of a neighborhood group that organizes events and community outreach. I think it could be a good way to connect with people here, show them who you are, not just what that video shows." Darnell raised an eyebrow. "You really think that's going to change anything?" "I do," she said with conviction. "People fear what they don't understand. Maybe if they get to know you, it'll help break down some of those walls." He considered her words, the idea both appealing and daunting. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Emily smiled. "That's all I ask." She shifted her toddler again and glanced at the clock. "I should get going, but if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call me." "Thanks, Emily," Darnell said, walking her to the door. After she left, Darnell sat back down at the table, his food cold but untouched. He opened the community group page again and scrolled through the comments. Amid the chaos, he noticed a post from Bill. "This town is better than what we saw today. Let's show it by supporting each other, not tearing each other down." Darnell stared at the words, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe there was a way to turn this ugly moment into something meaningful. The next morning, Darnell woke up with a renewed sense of determination. He had spent much of the night wrestling with Emily's suggestion. While the idea of engaging more with the community seemed daunting, he couldn't deny the possibility of turning the narrative around. After his morning coffee, Darnell opened his laptop and logged into the community group. Bill's post had gained traction overnight, with dozens of people chiming in to share their support or voice concerns about the incident. Many had tagged Darnell directly, asking if he was okay or offering apologies on behalf of the town. One comment in particular caught his eye. "Darnell, if you're reading this, don't let one bad apple spoil your view of the whole orchard. We're better than this, and we'd love to have you join us at the next community meeting." The message was from a woman named Sarah, who appeared to be one of the group's moderators. Darnell clicked on her profile and saw pictures of her at various town events, always surrounded by smiling people. With a deep breath, he typed a reply. "Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate the support. I'll think about attending the meeting." He hit send and closed his laptop, feeling both apprehensive and hopeful. A week later, Darnell found himself standing outside the local community center. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine and freshly fallen leaves. Through the large glass windows, he could see a small crowd gathered inside, chatting and laughing as they arranged chairs in a semicircle. Darnell hesitated, his hand resting on the door handle. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the town in such a direct way, but Emily's words echoed in his mind, "People fear what they don't understand." Summoning his courage, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room quieted for a moment as heads turned to see who had entered. Darnell felt the weight of their gazes but stood tall, offering a polite nod. "Darnell!" Sarah called out, waving him over. She was a tall woman with curly auburn hair and a warm smile that immediately put him at ease. "I'm so glad you came." "Thanks for inviting me," Darnell said, shaking her hand. "Of course," she said. "We're just getting started. Feel free to grab a seat." As Darnell settled into a chair near the back, he noticed Emily sitting a few rows ahead, her toddler playing quietly with a toy at her feet. She turned and gave him an encouraging smile, which he returned. The meeting began with updates on various town projects, a park cleanup initiative, a fundraising drive for the local library, and plans for a holiday festival. The atmosphere was casual and friendly, with people chiming in to share ideas or volunteer their time. Eventually, Sarah brought up the incident at the grocery store. "I think we all saw the video," she began, her tone serious. "It was a stark reminder that we still have work to do as a community." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. "I've spoken with several of you about how we can address this," Sarah continued. "One idea that came up was hosting a series of events to celebrate diversity and foster understanding among neighbors. Darnell, I hope you don't mind me putting you on the spot, but I think you'd have some valuable insights to share." All eyes turned to Darnell, and he felt a pang of nervousness. But as he looked around the room, he saw genuine interest and curiosity in their expressions. Sure," he said, standing up. "I think it's a great idea. When I moved here, I was looking for a fresh start, a place where I could feel at home. What happened at the store was disappointing, but the support I've received from many of you has been uplifting." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "If there's one thing I've learned, it's that change doesn't happen overnight. But it can start with conversations like this. Events that bring people together, show them what they have in common. That's where we can make a difference." Applause broke out, and Darnell sat down, his heart pounding but his spirits lifted. After the meeting, several people approached him to introduce themselves and offer support. Bill was among them, clapping Darnell on the back. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," Bill said. "This town needs more folks like you." "Thanks, Bill," Darnell replied, genuinely touched. As the crowd thinned out, Emily approached him with her stroller in tow. "You did great," she said. "Thanks," Darnell said. "It felt good, actually. Like maybe things can change." "They can," Emily said. "You just have to keep showing up." Darnell nodded, feeling a spark of optimism he hadn't felt in a long time. The weeks following the community meeting were a whirlwind of activity. Darnell found himself attending planning sessions, brainstorming ideas for the diversity events, and even volunteering to help organize a cultural showcase at the town square. It was a far cry from the quiet, reserved life he'd envisioned when moving to the town, but something about the work felt fulfilling. The first event, a neighborhood potluck, brought together people from all corners of the community. Tables laden with dishes from different cultures lined the park pavilion. Darnell, along with a few other volunteers, had spent hours setting up decorations and arranging the seating. As he stood by the welcome table, greeting attendees, he felt a mixture of nerves and pride. The turnout was far greater than anyone had anticipated, with families, couples, and individuals of all backgrounds milling about, chatting and laughing as they sampled the food. Emily arrived with her toddler, waving as she approached. "This is incredible," she said, gesturing to the crowd. "It really is," Darnell agreed. "I wasn't sure how many people would show up, but this," he trailed off, taking in the vibrant scene. "This is amazing." As the evening wore on, Darnell found himself in conversations with neighbors he'd never met before. Some shared stories of their own experiences with prejudice, while others expressed a desire to learn and grow. One interaction stood out. An older couple approached him, their expressions a mix of hesitation and sincerity. "Darnell, right?" the man asked. "That's me," Darnell said, offering a handshake. The man took it, his grip firm. "I wanted to apologize. My wife and I were at the store that day, and we didn't speak up. We should have. It's been bothering us ever since." Darnell studied their faces, seeing genuine remorse. "It's okay," he said. "What matters is that you're here now, trying to make things better." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening. "Thank you for giving us that chance." As the potluck wound down, Sarah took the microphone to thank everyone for coming and to announce the next event, a panel discussion on building inclusive communities. "None of this would have been possible without Darnell," she said, prompting a round of applause. Caught off guard, Darnell raised a hand in acknowledgement, his cheeks warming. After the event, as he was packing up tables with a few other volunteers, Bill approached him with a sly grin. "Didn't think you'd be the face of change in this town, did you?" Darnell chuckled. "Not exactly, but it feels good to be part of something positive." Bill nodded. "You're doing more than that. You're showing people what's possible. That matters." But not everyone in town embraced the changes. Darnell received an anonymous note in his mailbox a few days later. Scrawled in jagged handwriting, it read, "Stay in your lane. We don't want you here." The words hit like a punch, momentarily knocking the wind out of him. For a moment, he considered stepping back, letting others take the lead. But then he thought of the faces at the potluck, the conversations he'd had, the connections he'd built. He tore the note in half and tossed it in the trash. The following morning, he called Sarah. "I'm all in," he said. Over the next few months, the events grew in scale and impact. The cultural showcase brought performers and artisans from nearby towns, drawing a massive crowd to the town square. The panel discussion sparked thoughtful dialogue, with attendees sharing their own experiences and ideas for fostering unity. Darnell became a familiar face in the community, not just as the man from the grocery store video but as someone who had helped bridge divides and inspire change. One evening, as he walked home from a planning meeting, he saw the elderly woman from the store standing on her porch. Her gaze met his, and for a brief moment, Darnell wondered if she might say something. But she simply turned and went inside. Darnell paused, staring at the closed door. He didn't need her validation or her apology. What mattered was that he had found his place in the community and was helping to shape it into something better. As he continued down the street, the sound of children playing and neighbors chatting filled the air. The town wasn't perfect, but it was growing, and so was Darnell's sense of belonging. He smiled, knowing the work was far from over but also knowing he wasn't alone in it anymore. If you like this story, share your thoughts and observations in the comment section below, and make sure to like and subscribe for the next interesting and entertaining story ever.